Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing amazing today. We have the Cold War from the Soviet perspective, POV. This is by Viki1999. I just subscribed. It's a brand new channel. Good recommendation. The video link will be in the description. So I might have got that name wrong, but we might be doing more content from this individual in the future. So very excited about that. Um, yeah, let's jump right into it. This should be interesting because, we look at things a lot through our Western lens, but I like having a holistic look at things. So this is what we're doing.
Just told from another perspective. The
Right,
point of
sorry.
everything, please note that everything I'm about to say is historically and factually accurate. Just told from another perspective. The point of this isn't to defend the Soviet Union or to side with it. The point is to get you to think about biases we encounter when hearing about history. More about that in the conclusion. The Cold War started right after the Second World War, so to discuss it, we must start there.
Even before, right? Even like, depends on your perspective on when it started. I even think it started when we were building the Manhattan, during the Manhattan Project, when we were building the bombs and we had Soviet versus Western, or USA versus Soviet passive aggressiveness, especially when we look at the end of the war, like towards the Russo Japanese borders, and then like what could have happened if Hokkaido fell to the Russians and what the terms would be, and like the bombs and the display of aggression of Truman to Stalin during the forget where they met. But basically, it's I think it even started prior to the signing of the armistice.
In 1939, the fascist armies of Germany invaded most of Europe. At the same time, the fascist army of Japan was invading China as well as other nations and colonies in the Far East. In 1941, the German fascists started a surprise attack against the Soviet Union in an attempt to destroy the Socialist Revolution and the Bolshevik government. Only through the sacrifice of the Soviet soldiers the German advance was halted. The balance of power slowly shifted as the centrally planned economy of the USSR was adapted towards wartime production. At this time, the capitalist countries finally decided to join on the side of the USSR, though it would take another 2 more years and millions of Soviet dead before they actually joined the fight on the ground. By the time D-Day had happened, the German army was in full retreat already and almost pushed out of the Soviet lands.
Right, and that's a very good point to bring up. It was really because after Dunkirk, right? I think I mean, there's not a ground invasion. There's stuff going on in North Africa. There's stuff going on in the Pacific, but there's not really a lot happening on like Europe, right? You have some resistance here and there, for sure, but really, it becomes Viking France, and then you have a lot of subservient nations under the German rule with German appointed governors or whatever you want to call it. Um, but then you really just have air raids. It's bombing campaigns on both sides for a few years until finally, like I said, D-Day happens in Normandy, and from there you really start to see the Italian peninsula change. You start to see stuff in the Balkans change, Middle East change, and there's an island hopping campaign going on ever since 1941. Well, 42 really.
Within 1 more year, the war in Europe was over and only Japan was still fighting. The Soviet army was advancing in Manchuria and Korea, just as the United States used 2 nuclear bombs on civilian targets in Japan, both to fight the fascists and to send a threat towards the Soviets.
And let's talk about that. I know we're almost tangenting away from the subject matter, but it's really important to understand the foundations of things. I honestly have looked at things so many ways. I don't know. I don't know if like the like after really studying this, I don't really know if those atomic bombs did much. And you'd be like, "What?" I really don't think they did much in terms. I think there's some shade they colored into the possible armistice ahead of time, but this right here, this Manchurian invasion of the Soviet force, the speed and aggression and efficiency of what occurred here frightened the Japanese far more than some bombing campaigns that the United States did, because this rich territory that Manchuria was in square miles as well as like resources was just, they moved the lines and the goalposts so quickly that the Japanese military could not fight like they could fight how they fought against the Americans in the Pacific. It's a whole different ballgame. Of course, we assisted the both the Chinese parties during some of the uprising against the Japanese during the occupation. So we did a little bit of that, but like most of the American side was island hopping campaigns and fleet raids and bombing campaigns to the to the Japanese mainland. But I really think that this is right here, snapshot right here is when the Cold War began. It was the race to Kyoto, forget which the capital was in 1945, but that was the race. That's when the Cold War really begins, the competitive nature right here.
Nuclear bombs on civilian targets in Japan, both to fight the fascists and to send a threat towards the Soviets. Japan was to be occupied by the United States exclusively. The US and USSR could not agree on what to do with Korea, most importantly what economic system it should use, so they decided to split it up and figure it out later. In Europe, the capitalist nations and the Soviet Union met in order to discuss how to prevent another European war and how to rebuild the destroyed continent. They couldn't agree.
Well, yeah, this was even before that, right here. This was when FDR was still alive. But by the time we dropped the bombs, it was Truman sitting in the middle.
Agree on anything, most importantly what economic system the continent should follow.
And I don't even know if Churchill was there at the end. I think he got voted out.
So they decided to split the continent up and figure it out later. The eastern countries were to be rebuilt by the Soviet Union and the western ones by the US, UK and France. Germany, right in the middle, was split up between the USSR and the capitalist nations, with Berlin being split up again. The Soviet Union was not able to support the eastern nations as it had to rebuild itself first. In the western nations, the free market was instituted and quickly did absolutely nothing. The US government did what it always did and does when capitalism isn't working and gave away free money to stimulate the economy. This was called the Marshall Plan. To be more specific, capitalist nations were given US dollars, which had to be used on imports. I wonder what kind of country had an export-oriented economy which wasn't damaged in a war and which accepted US dollars. Well, so essentially the US government was giving money to their friends which they then had to spend on US goods. In addition to this, much of
now that does disregard the light of the nature of which US goods can help supply the economy. I mean, those are basically like, that's a stimulus check with an asterisk on it, right? So it really doesn't help your local economy, but it helps with. So that's the thing though. It doesn't really help your local currency and your local economy, bolstering the U.S. dollar. So there is like some quid pro quo here. So he does have a good sentiment with how he's talking about this. However, we can't not also say that the goods that these stimulus checks gave helped the people by sure. They definitely did help the people.
the industry of Western capitalist nations was bought up or indebted to American capitalists and banks, who loaned money to the rebuilding continent. On top of that, the USA used the political leverage they got from the Marshall Plan to influence the elections in nations they occupied.
That, yeah. I mean, you can look at the CIA for that one.
Towards liberal free market economies. Essentially, the Western European nations were turned into economic colonies or puppet states of the US. When Germany was split up, the four powers agreed on some conditions and rules they would follow in this joint occupation. Among them, they decided to use the same currency in Germany in order to make the reunification easier. This German currency was plagued by hyperinflation, which made the occupied territories illegible for the Marshall Plan. The obvious solution by the capitalist nations was to introduce a new currency. They did not discuss this at the four power meetings, they did not even inform the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. They just did it. This was seen as a breach of international law by the USSR, which then left the four power meetings altogether. The General Secretary was not happy with the partition of Germany in general. Pretty much all natural resources and industry of Germany are located here, outside of the Soviet zone. This was seen
Well, that's just a geographical coincidence.
as an injustice, as the USSR had lost most blood in defeating fascism, and it felt like it deserved a richer area to pay.
That's. Come on. Come on. What do you want, France too? It's just a circumstantial geographical thing, like, at that point. Like, that's not fair to say. That because we lost more, we deserve more. Is it?
Reparations. The only industrial region of the Soviet occupation zone was Berlin, and Stalin demanded all of it so they may pay reparations. So Stalin demanded that the Allies stop their occupation of Berlin. When the Allies refused, he blockaded it. The blockade is when the Cold War officially starts. The Allies used planes to fly the supplies in, by the way, and Stalin stopped the blockade after about a year. And shortly later, the capitalist powers gave up any pretense of allowing Germany to unify, as they set up their own capitalist puppet state in their zones of occupation. A short time later, Stalin decided he could no longer occupy Germany and gave them a state of their own, the German Democratic Republic. Germany was now split. Stalin made a suggestion to the capitalist nations. He wanted to create a unified democratic Germany with international supervision. The Western nations declined this offer because they were afraid that the large socialist population in Germany may democratically vote to become socialist.
Yeah, there's definitely some geopolitics on both sides when it comes to like the bigger picture here. So I mean, obviously you're gonna have biases on both parts.
And we all know that the problem with democracy is that sometimes the people vote differently from how you want them to. And
yeah, that's a good one.
the adult way to react to that is to simply not allow them to vote at all. On a strategic level, Europe was now divided and the capitalists were gearing for war. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill outright prepared a plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union called Operation Unthinkable, and the US Army was stationing bombers with nuclear bombs around the world in order to threaten and eventually destroy the Soviet Union and the socialist revolution therein. Luckily, there were people in the United States who were on the side of the people and who decided to send plans of the nuclear bombs to the Soviet Union. By 1949, the USSR had tested its...
Wait, did I hear that right?
Luckily, there were people in the United States who were on the side of the people and who decided to send plans of the nuclear bombs to the Soviet Union. But
I don't think that's their intent. I think they sold their plans. I don't think that I think they were spies. I don't think that they did it for the good of the people. That's a weird one.
in 1949, the USSR had tested its first nuclear warhead. The US and USSR would continuously develop new and stronger nuclear weapons for...
And my stance on nuclear is like, let's just not do it. Let's just not do it. United States, let's go all the way down to civilian only. So with Russia, we've had this conversation many times if you've been on this channel for a while. Israel, you have it too. No, you can't have it. Pakistan, you can't have it. India, you can't have it. UK, France, you can't have it. It's because if one person has it, everyone has it. If one person doesn't have it, nobody should have it. It should be binary. We're all people.
The entire Cold War in order to keep the advantage on their side for when the inevitable war between capitalism and socialism would start. Meanwhile, in the United States, everyone who was a communist or a suspected communist was fired, arrested, and worse, in what's known as the McCarthy era.
Red Scare.
Throughout this, the United States still claimed to support freedom of expression. Then in order to totally not...
Yeah, and that's everywhere though. That's the United States is always the poster child for freedom, but there's like infringement on that, so it's always radicalized and shown light on, but it's everywhere. But also in the same light, like it's like under national security risk. That is like the pretext of like we're gonna strip this or we're gonna do this. It's ridiculous. I agree.
Not escalate the Cold War, the capitalist nations banded together and formed NATO, an aggressive military alliance designed to threaten the Soviet Union and contain the revolution. Let's have a look at China. It was in a civil war. The main factions were the communists.
It had been in a civil war too, like for years prior to the Russian, before the Japanese occupation. And holy moly, Mao Zedong and his party just pulled off an underdog story.
People's Liberation Army under the leadership of Mao Zedong, and the practically fascist Chinese Nationalist Party under the leadership of some fascist guy. I don't know. You won't remember the name.
Sun Yat-sen? I think that's his name.
Anyway, they have been fighting since before World War II, then stopped when the Japanese showed up and started doing genocide, and right after the Japanese had surrendered, they were at each other's throats again. Long story short, the communists win and the nationalists have to go on this island. They pretend to be the real China until this day, though nobody takes them seriously.
Nobody takes them seriously? Are you serious? I think the United States and the Western powers still take them seriously. I think the Philippines take them seriously. But we depending on the pretense of what you say. Obviously, this is not the real China, but when we say we take that seriously, this is a sovereign nation called Taiwan. It's been that way for 40, 50, 60, 70 years. It's going to be that way as long as the United States and the Western powers hold firm. I believe they should, and there is no chance that Taiwan will ever be invaded from the outside. It will only be possible on the inside. Their defenses are unimaginably creative. There's no way that the Chinese Army, Navy, Air Force could ever successfully throw anything at this island without mass casualties on the attack. And that's a whole nother video conversation. I just wanted to throw that out. If you want to discuss more, put it in the comments.
In Korea, both the USA and USSR had installed temporary local leaders, which acted as placeholders until the peninsula would be united again. But after the capitalist nations had made it clear that the united Germany would not happen unless the Soviet Union agreed that it would be a capitalist state, the government in North Korea became a bit anxious. It was a socialist government backed by the USSR. The South was seen as occupied territory by the North, especially as the fascist capitalist government there was close friends with and funded by the American government.
Yeah, both sides have ponies in this race.
The Southern government committed many war crimes against suspected communists, often under the direction of US troops. By 1950, the North Korean government under Kim Il-sung decided to put an end to the fascists and start the liberation war against the dictatorship.
I don't want to pause here because I've kind of like rehearsed some of these things in my head after hearing a lot of this so far. I want to make a claim real quick. I am not defending the United States at all. There's so many war crimes the United States has, and we'll get to Vietnam, which is where a lot of them are. But yeah, there's horrendous war crimes by the United States in pretty much any conflict that we've ever been in. And I mean, I think it goes for human nature. So labels are one thing that I really like to stray away from. So communist versus capitalist, there's so much gray. It's not just black and white or red and blue. There's so much gray. There's so much gray.
When almost the entire peninsula was liberated, many capitalist nations came to support the fascist dictatorship. The effort of half of the world was not in vain, and the North Korean army was pushed back. Fearing that the capitalists might just keep going and invade Manchuria after they were done with Korea, Chairman Mao Zedong decided to send support to Korea. That support came in the form of 500,000 soldiers. The US general wanted to use
That was more than that.
Nuclear weapons on the Chinese People's Liberation Army, but the president refused because of the fear that the Soviet Union might intervene and use their own nuclear weapons as well.
Well, yeah, humanity. Come on.
After 3 years, the fronts were back to where they were before, and the Korean governments agreed on an armistice, which is in power until today.
Right, did I hear that right, though?
The weapons on the Chinese People's Liberation Army, but the President Zedong decided to send support to Korea. That support came in the form of 500,000 soldiers. The US general wanted to use nuclear weapons on
MacArthur, and yeah, he was fired actually, and he actually wanted to nuke China.
The Chinese People's Liberation Army, but the president refused because of the fear that the Soviet Union might intervene and use their own nuclear weapons as well. After 3 years, the fronts were back to where they were before, and the Korean governments agreed on an armistice, which is in power until today. The South Korean people suffered under a series of US-backed fascist dictatorships until 1987, when they moved to a neoliberal democracy. Let's have a look at Germany again. Corrections, Germanese, plural. In the 50s, they were brought up under drastically different economic systems. West Germany was organized in a capitalist free market economy, and at first it wasn't doing well. After being included in the Marshall Plan, however, it quickly started doing pretty well. Remember, the Marshall Plan was basically the US giving free money to capitalists to help them fund businesses and such. Meanwhile, East Germany had a centralized socialist economy which had a harder time growing, since they didn't have access to the same amount of free money. Also, the Soviets had taken loads of money and industrial machinery as reparations, since Germany kind of destroyed all of Russia like 5 years earlier. On top of that, the East German economy was smaller at the beginning of the separation, as I've
remember those resources
mentioned before. So economically, West Germany was doing better. But East Germany had its perks, among others a 0% unemployment rate, free healthcare, free education, and so on. West Germany had none of those at this time. So the East had many highly educated people who were educated by the state and expected to help improve the country in exchange. So it kind of sucked for the East German government to see the West Germans handing out free money to everyone with higher education who would move from East Germany to West Germany.
Kind of funny.
The West German government also made sure to spread lots of propaganda about how anyone
Oh yeah, both sides, by the way.
could become rich under capitalism.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So young people who were educated for free by the East German state and who were expected to return this value to the state via working
Expected? I thought it was free.
there, decided to leave to a capitalist country in hopes of making themselves rich off their stolen East German education. This was seen as a betrayal by the East German state, and some went as far as to denounce those who left for West Germany as traitors to their nation. And there were more problems originating in West Berlin. The Cold War was a really good time for spies.
Sounds like a prison if you're like, you have to stay.
The West was spying on the East, and the East was spying on the West. Remember
We know that from the UT plane that fell out in, was it Georgia or is it Turkey?
the nuclear bombs from the US? They were brought to the USSR by spies. And
Yes.
there were many spies moving from East to West and the other way around. And the key path they used was Berlin. The reason for that is that there was no border there. You could just walk down the street and you'd be out of the country you're spying on and inside the country you're spying for. And at one point, the Politburo decided to handle these problems originating in Berlin accordingly. In order to stop the traitors and spies, the decision was made to impose the border in Berlin the same way the outside borders of the country were imposed. This meant border guards, checkpoints, barbed wire, and no crossing without reason. The capitalist countries were quick to complain about the Berlin
So if you weren't a spy, how could you go? Could you still cross?
Wall, as it became known. They said the East German government had torn Berlin apart. A brave statement considering it was the Western powers that continued to occupy half of the capital city of another country. Like,
There's a lot of contradictions there. I do agree, by the way, but I want to be fair on both sides.
can you imagine Saudi Arabia occupying half of Washington DC and then complaining that the US is tearing Washington apart when they begin to guard their border? Okay, while a brave statement considering it was the Western powers that continued to occupy half of the capital city of another country. Like, can you imagine Saudi Arabia occupying half of Washington DC and then complaining that the US is tearing Washington apart when they begin to guard their border? Okay, while I'm outside of the monologue, I'd like to address some serious
Well, just depends on who's in charge, right?
misinformation about the Berlin Wall. It's often said that it was locking people in or out, and that's not quite true. If you were West German and wanted to go to West Berlin or the other way around, you could just use the East German highways to do so. West Berlin was not trapped, they could leave at any time.
Any? Really? You sure about that?
And it is often said that the wall was tearing families apart by preventing travel. That's a very biased way of telling the story. East Germans were allowed to visit West Germany provided they had a reason, and a marriage, a funeral, or even just visiting a sick relative were enough. And West Germans could visit East Germany just as well. Saying that the wall separated families is technically true, but by that logic you'd have to agree that all borders do so, and that
That's true. Like if you go to Canada, you're not just gonna go to Canada. You have to actually have a checkpoint. You usually have to like state your reasoning of why you're staying, how long you're staying, what's it for, do you have any contraband. So I agree with the statements here. However, a lot of stuff that I have consumed, we can say has a bias. I don't like saying everything has a bias because then there's labels and there's so much, even though in human nature everything's biased, right? But bias actually has two definitions. There's the regular definition and there's that labeled definition, pre-assuming bias because of a categorical like genre something's in, or if something's created by somebody that's acclaimed to an American media association, then they're biased by de facto. So we have to jump back and look at things from above. From the above sector, all I've seen in the past is like where people could not travel. It was a locked border. I have not seen where there has been nuances where there's opportunity to go here or there because of circumstantial reasoning. It could be true. I'm not gonna, like, one thing with me, how I look at any video and anything in history, I don't lock down conversation and I don't lock down assumptions. I am very much a open book. So if there was circumstances in this case. Well, that's interesting, and that shades in more gray that we've been talking about, because this is all gray, right? There is no binary here.
All borders should be considered as bad as the Berlin Wall, which is a road you could go down, but it isn't usually thought to its conclusion like that. Anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, the Berlin Wall was built and enforced as a regular border. This stayed up for a bit and will return to Germany once something happens there. Meanwhile, in the USSR, Stalin died and Khrushchev was telling everyone that he was bad. This started a tradition.
Yeah, that was when you had the fallout of Stalinism. Everybody started tearing down statues. The war crimes and atrocities which Stalin had perpetrated on his people and the POWs was very much out there in public. So hope that's not, bounced over.
Of Soviet leaders being shit-talked once they died, something that did not help the Soviet Union with stability.
It definitely did though, because they took a breath. They had unity and transparency. You didn't have that much transparency during Stalin's years, but you had a huge sigh of relief. A huge sigh of relief over there. There were still, a tons of things on both sides where there's a lot of secrecy to this day on both sides continuously. But I promise you one thing: the average person in Russia, and this is an assumption, the average person in Russia really appreciated talking about the elephant in the room.
In order to counter NATO, the Soviet Union founded the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance with the express goal of countering NATO, not threatening the USA, just creating a counterweight to capitalist aggression. Also, the nations have now figured out how to make even more deadly bombs and how to use rockets to deliver them without them being intercepted. These rockets could also be used differently. In 1957, some Soviet scientists got very excited to use those missiles to learn stuff about space.
And this is where you get so much going on, like the space race. You got ballistic missile conversations. You have satellites. You get Kennedy. We're gonna put a man on the moon. All that derives right here.
And after a bit of development, they managed to put the first ever artificial satellite in space, Sputnik. It was just a silver ball going beep beep in space, but
very, very high tech. Amazing. Like, we look at something like this and we're like, yeah, that looks like garbage. No, that is unbelievable. Imagine, let's take a breath and let's go to the year like 1700. They could not even sci-fi, not even a sci-fi writer at the time could ideate something like this.
It was a tremendous achievement for humanity. I say for humanity, and in the socialist nations it was definitely seen as such, but in the capitalist nations the public reacted different.
See, that's what I don't like. Stop. Stop being your. This is this is the title, the bias and storytelling. There's innovation militarily everywhere. We can't just always point at the capitalist nations being the bad guys. I'm not saying the communist nations are the bad guys either. I'm just saying collectively, it's collective, guys.
They were scared of Sputnik because now suddenly they saw that the socialist nations were
That is very true, though.
Technologically superior. This was known as the Sputnik crisis. The USA then decided to do the same and put an artificial satellite in orbit. The first rocket promptly blew up on the launch pad in front of the media of the whole world. Then the Soviet Union sent a dog to space. Her name was Laika, and she was the first living animal ever to reach space. Then the USSR sent a man to space, then took the first picture of the dark side of the moon, the first automated landing on the moon, the first woman in space, the first landing on another planet, all with the US.
Landing on another planet? What? Is that true? I don't know if that's true. I don't know.
Lagging behind the Soviet Union. So, in an effort to not look totally inferior anymore, the US president announced that they would land on the moon. Long story short, after enlisting literal genocide.
Oh, I have to read this meme. World War II is over and the USSR has been razed to the ground. Well, that's a loaded statement, but they began a massive industrialization campaign before the war. Very true. To catch up with the rest of Europe, because serfdom had been a thing all the way up to the Russian Revolution. They rebuilt all of Eastern Europe in half a decade. Okay. They helped Chinese communists win and helped found the DPRK. What's DPRK? I'm sorry, I'm just smart. They rapidly advanced their sciences and technologies. You realize they're significantly more technologically advanced than you. Yeah, I mean, they were.
The US president announced that they would land on the moon. Long story short, after enlisting literal genocidal Nazis in their spaceflight program, they
Operation Paperclip.
managed it. Then they stuck their flag into the moon, presumably in an attempt to make it theirs, and declared that
No, it wasn't to make it ours. And I said ours because if you haven't could not tell, I'm an American. I don't think that's the intent. I strongly disagree with that intent. The moon is communal, and it should always be that way.
they had won the space race. Before that, the
That is true. That definitely is true.
Soviet government put out a statement declaring moon landings are too dangerous to attempt.
That now the space race has always been about putting a man on the moon. That's always what it's been. And we know 1000% that's to be true. You can't say checkpoints equal de facto win. And we can't stack 5 over here and 1 over here and then say the 5 because it was a race to the moon.
The landing was seen live on TV by billions of people, including in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
The government of the USSR then suggested a joint moon landing as a sign of friendship.
That would be awesome.
While the USSR never landed on the moon, there was a joint mission between American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts in 1975, when they docked their spaceships and said hi or something like that. Let's now have a look at Cuba.
What did he say? Did he say Sig Heil? Oh, I thought he said Sig Heil. He said hi. Oh.
When they docked their spaceships and said hi or something like that. Let's now have a look at Cuba. Cuba
Here we are.
belonged to the US for a long time. Then these handsome men came along and made it not so. They did a socialism, so the US tried to invade but failed. Quick look at Turkey. They joined NATO and the USA had set up nuclear missiles there which could directly attack Moscow and kill millions of people. After the Cuban Revolution, the Soviet General Secretary called and asked if they wanted to help do the same to the US. Cuba agreed and the USSR was about to place nuclear missiles there when the Americans noticed. The US president did not want to allow the USSR to do the same as they had done, so he forbid Cuba to place Soviet missiles there. Then they enforced a blockade on Cuba, which they enforced by throwing depth charges at Soviet submarines, which were armed with nuclear weapons. Please note that this is an act of war, both the blockade and the throwing depth charges at the nuclear submarine. But hey, what could go wrong? It's not like the crew of the submarine could have assumed that war had broken out and that they should fire their nuclear torpedo at the American fleet, right? Oh yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and power went out in one of those submarines, and thank God that there was some resilience in the minds of those Soviet officers down there underneath that water, because oxygen was going to run low. We have to take a step back and thank those heroes. Yeah, those Soviet heroes that saved the world. And you listening to this would not be here unless you're older than 1962. Well, you still probably wouldn't be here.
The world came within one decision of a nuclear war because the capitalist country didn't want to allow another country to do the same thing they had done, and because it had decided that attacking a nuclear submarine was
World's for thee, but not for me. That's true there.
somehow okay. It turned out well in the end. The USA agreed to remove nuclear missiles from Turkey, and the USSR agreed not to put nuclear missiles on Cuba.
But to be fair, Kennedy was a very reasonable person comparatively to like the previous industrial mobilization that we had with Truman, and then inherited by Eisenhower. Eisenhower's farewell speech, he bewares the country, bewares the administrations of the future of the military industrialization the Pentagon has created. There is so much just technological growth that also intervenes with military alignment. It's insane. But Kennedy and RFK specifically really did well when it comes to the conversations with the Russian administration to kind of appease the exchangement of future removal of the missiles in Turkey.
In case you were wondering, no. The international community did not take action against the USA.
What are they going to do, the international community? They don't have nuclear weapons. Maybe they do. Wait, do they? Can't remember. Cannot remember if China has anything yet, or the UK or France. Nevertheless, what are they going to do in this city? There's two superpowers in 1962. That's it. That's it.
For attacking the ships of a country they were at peace with, or for enforcing a blockade in peace.
Like there's two, like it's a bi-hegemonic like system at this point.
Times. Let's have a look at Vietnam, shall we?
Oh God.
So basically, in the before times, that means before 1900, France came along and took this land. That's imperialism. Skipping over a lot of history, the people here did not like being a colony of France anymore, and after World War II, France was not able to kill all of them anymore, so in 1954, at the Geneva Conference, they decided what to do with this area. They decided to split it up into these three countries. These two became monarchies. But wait, Vietnam had lots of communists in it, and they wanted to rule the country. But the capitalist countries did not want that. The US and USSR could not agree on what to do with Vietnam, most importantly what economic system it should follow, so they decided to split it up and figure it out later. But unlike with Germany and Korea, this time they had agreed on how to figure it out. This part would be communist, this part would be capitalist, and in 2 years they would unify and hold one national election under international supervision to decide what economic system out of
That's just like kicking the can down the road times a million.
Vietnam should use. What a great solution! Unfortunately, it was predicted that the North would win because it had a higher population. So the US decided that rather than risking the small country doing what the people want, they should launch a full-scale invasion. Essentially,
Yeah, because under the pretext of domino effect, and this happened, like you said, in the 50s, and then there was more and more. This picture obviously was not in the 50s right here. This is the 1960s or 70s right here. But, I mean, if we look at, like, the pretext, what I just said about, like, Kennedy was most likely going to pull more people out of Vietnam and allow the system to kind of, like, just marinate, right? But good old LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, ramped it up.
Vietnam War boiled down to the capitalists thinking they would win because of their technological superiority, but then get
in a crazy, like we talk about the Spanish Napoleonic War. This was that times 100.
getting wrecked by a few farmers armed with AK-47s. By 1974, the US president decided to retreat and give up while pretending that they totally won. The capitalist southern government fell within 1 year and all of Vietnam was now socialist. Let's now look at Afghanistan. To sum it up
Afghanistan, so we're going to go to 1979?
painfully quickly, the government was overthrown by a new socialist government known as the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. This government was quickly attacked by reactionary insurgencies and then asked the Soviet Union to help. And as you do among comrades, in 1979, the USSR intervened. The USA then gave lots of money to the people fighting the USSR, that being Al-Qaeda among others. After about 10 years, the Soviet government decided it could no longer deal with this and left again. The Democratic Republic of Afghanistan then quickly fell to the reactionary armies. Those armies then later blew up 2 towers in New York, but that's a different story.
A way different story.
At this time, the Cold War was warming up. This is known as détente. The USA and USSR were still pointing nuclear weapons at each other, but now at least they weren't throwing live bombs at nuclear submarines.
And I'm sorry for being such a stickler. This is not 1979. Nixon would not be there. That would be Carter.
Anymore. They signed the SALT Treaty, which stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty,
So that was while Nixon was there.
which limited the number of nuclear bombs and missiles they could make. As is tradition, I completely neglected Latin America in this video. Basically, it's always the same story. A country elects a socialist government, and then this...
Not just when he says Latin America, it's not just South America, it's also Central America too. Like Guatemala, Operation Just Cause. There's some things that are related, some things that are kind of tangent, but...
CIA stages a coup and kills all suspected communists and props up a fascist puppet regime there. There's a Wikipedia article about it. If I mentioned all of those...
Yeah, look at this. Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, Chile, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay.
The video would be twice as long. In the late 80s, the German people were demonstrating against the Berlin Wall. To oversimplify, they had been talking about letting people travel over the inter-German border without visa for some time. Then this man misread
This guy. Poor guy.
something in a press briefing, and as a result, half of the population of East Berlin wanted to go have a
He said it was open. He said, yeah, it's open.
look at the West. They thought they had the right to cross the border now. The guards still had orders not to let them pass. Eventually, they could not hold the people anymore and just let everyone
Yeah, can you imagine like them just? Yeah, I'm glad they didn't try to do anything.
go to West Berlin. The Berlin Wall was gone now. Please note that most people in East Germany did not want to live under capitalism or to unite with capitalist West Germans. What they wanted was a new and more democratic East German republic with good relations
Yeah, and neither side should have total control.
with and free movement to West Germany. 71% of East Germans opposed the unification of Germany.
Really?
Unfortunately, the Chancellor of West Germany wanted to get re-elected, so he united the two countries against the will of the people. There is a video to be made on this, since 30 years later the old East German states still suffer immensely from this, and they likely will for the next 50 years.
Why do you think that is? Because if it's unified, there should be, equal investment to each province, state, whatever this is.
Things like these were happening all over the socialist world, and many countries either formed their way into or were forced into free market capitalism. Then Gorbachev came into power in the USSR, and he implemented perestroika and glasnost, which were policies that had to do with, well, actually, the collapse of the Soviet Union is definitely gonna be its own video, so subscribe. Essentially, he did some reform, screwed it up, and collapsed the Soviet Union in the process. And this is where the Cold War ends, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this was my biased telling of the story of the Cold War. Please know, everything I said was correct. It's all true. So why does it sound like I'm an evil Soviet spy sent to indoctrinate everyone into thinking the capitalist nations were aggressors in the Cold War? Because we aren't used to hearing that part of the story. When talking about the Cold War, we hear about the Berlin Wall tearing families apart all the time. But we never talk about the fact that the US invaded a sovereign country because they were afraid that an election might go differently from how they wanted to go. We are used to thinking that the Soviets were aggressors in the Cuba crisis, placing missiles and such.
No, they weren't. I don't think so. That's where I agree.
But we barely even mentioned it. The US had been doing the same thing in Turkey, or that the US literally breached international law by imposing a blockade on Cuba during peacetime, and by attacking Soviet submarines. And we're used to thinking about the Soviet nations in the East as the Soviet Bloc, but we barely even talk about the fact that the entirety of Western Europe was practically controlled by the US. Do you think it's a
Well, we can't say one thing without the other. The Eastern Bloc was pretty much controlled by the USSR. We have to say that.
coincidence that no nation occupied by the Americans turned socialist? The Americans made sure to only support the correct parties, the same way the Soviets did.
There you go.
So, now you know the Soviet version of the story. Do I think that we should write this version in the history books?
Yeah.
Not really.
Oh.
It's just as biased as the story we already hear, and it's based on some shaky facts, just as
I think we should include both, but it depends where you live, I guess.
well. I'd like to hear a story without bias for once, not one
There is no such thing. There is no such thing.
where evil Stalin tried to starve Berlin into submission, or one where the evil capitalist nations refused to vacate the capital of a sovereign state. I want a story with both sides, not just the one we like better. Ultimately, it might be impossible to tell a story without bias, but at least now, after having watched this, you might be a bit better at detecting subtle biases. Always ask yourself what the other side of the story may look like, because maybe the Soviet side of the Cuban Missile Crisis might seem a lot more reasonable than the American one.
Oh yeah. Okay, let's back up. First off, great video. I loved it, actually. As you can tell, this is a very long video. I am not too combative against this. I think there was some points, and by the way, just a nomer, I don't like factual objectiveness where everything is true, period. I don't like that. Put a comma, don't put a period, because when you put a period, you really leave no room for conversation, and nuance and change of conversation. Just looking through right here, seeing what we talked about again. Yeah, I think the one thing where I'm not too for sure on, and I'll be the first to tell you, like, I don't know, is like like Berlin. That's like the nuance part. I don't really understand too much. Is what happened in Berlin and the conversation of a sovereign nation being invaded. Come on, Germany invaded everybody. That's where we're occupying. And it's been this way forever for any country that's ever invaded a country. They always get occupied. Like, just look at the Reconstruction era of the United States. Now, not to say, not to defend any of that. I'm just saying, like, this is just upon precedent. And past precedent, that's where the details I'm not too sure about. The economic zones, I'm not going to argue between communism and capitalism, but I will say capitalism usually gives you more free market economies where you can have more entrepreneurial spirit and longevity for small businesses. Usually, um, notice I didn't say always. And then I will, I 100, what else? What else? Korean War, yeah, that all made sense. Germany, the Berlin Wall thing, like that's one of the things that, like I said, I don't really know too much about the Berlin side. I'm not sure about like the free passage of I'm not sure about that. Uh Stalin, yeah, nobody liked Stalin like after he died and it showed. There was like it's kind of funny because like when Stalin died, like some of his doctors, quote unquote, and I'm just gonna say quote unquote because I'm not for sure because this could be biased. Some of his best doctors were no longer seeing him, and there was so much paranoia around him. There's so much paranoia around the Soviet Union during the years of like 1918. Well, it wasn't even the Soviet Union then. From the Russian Empire to like 1945, there's so or 53. There was so much paranoia all throughout the administrations. Um, but yeah, they had a huge sigh of relief after Stalin died. They had a breath of fresh air. Not to say that there was never any good. Stalin definitely, and that was another part. It's like, um, because there was so many more Soviet deaths, they should have X amount of. That's not fair. That's not fair because that's a slippery slope. Then you can kind of go down the line of like, you had this many Jewish deaths because so you need this, and that's a slippery slope. Or you could say, well, just as many Germans died. So see that, and just as many Japanese died, so they deserve. It just depends on like the confines of what the conversation is. So there's that. What else? Space race. Yeah, the United States won the space race. I don't think that's subjective. I think that's very objective. There was a note in the space race about is something landing on a planet. I'm not sure if that was a misnomer of the word planet to moon, or was there ever Soviet technology during the space race where let me go to this. Yeah, it's not mentioned. It was mentioned in the conversation, but it wasn't mentioned here. Um, so that's one thing. Like I don't think there was actually because Mars would be the only option. And I think we would have known about that. I'm not sure if that's true. So that's what I'm talking about, like factual objectiveness. The Cuban Missile Crisis, though, I 100% agree with everything you said about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is one of the stains on America is the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it's coupled with the hegemonic nuclear power. Like we were first, so I guess like maybe the Turkey missiles were there prior to this thing in a long enough span where the intent kind of shifted over time. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was disgusting, and the Bay of Pigs was disgusting. Um, but I mean, that's just the United States protecting our national security. You can't falter a country for that, but you can look at what laws were broken. But sometimes things just happen, you know. Not to say that things shouldn't happen. Sometimes things happen. You can't just look at things through one perspective. I really liked his perspective though on that because it made sense. What else? Vietnam War. Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't learned too much about the Vietnam War. I know pretty much what any 12th grader knows on that. Afghanistan, I'd say the same thing. I don't really know too much about that. Latin America, same thing. I really don't know too much about that. collapse of USSR 1991 with Berlin Wall. I think that's an interesting like conversation right here. I'm not sure how accurate this is. You know, I'm just not sure. Like, I'm not sure at all. I'm not sure about the population that lived in 1991 in East Germany would have been the same population that lived there in 1950 or 1945 in terms of the demographics, and it's literally a generation later. So that's an interesting question or conversation. But yeah, Gorbachev was a very, very key figure to world peace. Um, but who else? Khrushchev. Khrushchev was just doing the good for the USSR at the time. He was a really instrumental piece. Um, I don't really. The posturing with NATO is just. It's gonna get us into a really bad situation in the future. So I hope that settles down as we've seen like stuff happen in the Ukraine Russian war that's gone on for 30+ years now. I talked a lot. This is a long video. This is supposed to be like a 20-minute video, but you can tell it's an interesting conversation. And I don't want, like I said, I don't want to put a period on this. Leave me some comments. Combat me, please. I'm not doing that just to be like agitative. I'm like seriously, like I'd love to learn from your perspective. Love to hear your context. Type away. Tell me I'm stupid. Don't do that. Please don't do that. I'll see you guys next time. I appreciate you guys. Consider subscribing if you watch this whole thing. Peace out. Bye-bye.